So, Jonathan, this is such a joy, and I want to thank you deeply from the very core of me for being so generous and willing to open in this way to this wonderfully freestyle deep dialogues.
Well, it's an honour to be asked, and we've known each other a long time, so.
Well, it's very cherishing, Johnny, because it's been one of the great points that moves me so deeply is the way that I've been able to very easily review the wonder of your career, the way that it's developed. And you've been so generous and kind of asking me for insight at times. So I really want to thank you. And as I said earlier when we first sat down, I'm just so proud of what's happened for you and the wonders that you're creating.
Oh, well, thank you. And likewise, it's fun. It's lovely seeing how you've evolved over the years, and how you found, I think, something, and this is an extension of it too, which really suits you, because you had all these different sort of extraordinary skills, but we kind of seemed disconnected when I think we first met, and you found a brilliant way of bringing them all together.
Yeah. I have, and the time is ripe, as it is for yourself, in the sense of the permissibility around that aspect of spiritual intelligence is now becoming more mainstream, in the sense of moving through the diversity movement and through the levels of equity and parity that we're trying to create in our lives, even if they're just stumbling blocks at the moment. The fact is that those super objectives are there. And so it's much more permissible, and therefore, interestingly with me, as soon as I decided, it's now 15 years ago, to resign all of my establishment positions in the entertainment industry, that another world opened to me. However, back to you. I want to begin by just reminding us of what a fellow artist said about you, or wrote about you. And this is Dear Damien, when he wrote this. I have it before me. I don't know what it is that makes us who we are. And I don't know, when we look at each other's faces, how somehow, deep inside one another, we can see something. But I do know that Jonathan Yeo's portraits wrestle with all of these ideas. He is like Turner, strapping himself against the ship's mast in order to create a true likeness of the storm. Time and time again, Jonathan achieves what should be impossible, creating a true picture, an image, or a glimpse of people we think we know and those we never met. Yet Jonathan gives us complete portraits. And it's something I know that we talked about 30 years ago, that there's something very unique about the way that you perceive. I notice you're touched by that.
It's a nice description. Actually, he's got a great way with words, Damien Hirst, and it's one of those things which not many people kind of encapsulate something like that. I mean, not that it's particularly about my work. I think it's generally what you're trying to achieve with portraiture. I think he's put in a very beautiful, succinct way there.
Yeah. Maybe that's to do with the fact that he's obviously a wordsmith, as we can see, but maybe that's also to do with the fact that he's very visually oriented, as we see in all of the extraordinary iconoclastic creations that he has brought forth over the years.
Yeah. And
what's interesting about your work is that you've stayed very much, not in a linear fashion, but within the parameter of excelling time and time again with portraiture. I always, when people say, Jonathan Yeo, I always say, he's the contemporary Van Dyck. I hope that's okay for me to say that. Because you record... No! That wonderful Belge man, that wonderful Flemish man. Because you record our times through the expression of people's personalities. But more importantly, you go deeper. When you paint people's souls. And that was something that we talked about. And what I'd love to do is to go back to the very beginning and hear from you. How did this all begin?
That's a good question. The quick answer is I wasn't very good at other things academically, but because I had severe ADHD in retrospect, which obviously we didn't know about in those days. And I was, but I was, when I was left in the art room, I would, enjoy myself a lot. and I also, I found the classes I did all right in at school were the ones I was allowed to draw in, or at least I could get away with them not noticing. And the way to not let them notice was to be drawing the teacher, and I would then remember what they're talking about. But also, as a byproduct of that, then I would I'd also get I was learning how to caricature faces effectively. And portraiture is basically subtle caricature. You're trying to decide what to exaggerate, what to leave out. And the classes I wasn't allowed to draw in or was told off then were the ones where my mind would wander out the window and I would not remember a single word of it. And then various things happened. My sister was seriously ill, she had a brain tumor. I was last year at school. A lot of things threw me.
So you were 18, 19?
17, I think.
17, 18. Mm-hmm.
And or 16, 17, and that threw me, and I think a lot of things around that time threw me. And I left school, tried to make a living as an artist for a year, failed miserably because I had no idea what I was doing really. But I carried on painting. I ended up studying film for a few years. I got ill as well, had cancer when I was about 21, 22. And that was another kind of, a whole series of slightly kind of, out of control things. My dad, who was a politician, was kind of was very public, and then had a very sort of public sort of embarrassment, and had to sort of resign as a minister in the John Major government, and while I was ill, and all kinds of sort of dramas happened in the space of a few years. But it made me very sort of a bit more pig-headed really at the time. I thought, well, I'm going to, I was partly going and trying to doing painting to take my mind off other things. And then it was like, well, just because other people aren't saying it's a good idea for you to do as a career, why not have a go at it? And then so the portraiture happened almost by accident, because someone asked me to do a portrait commission. I was terrified, started it, went really badly. And then about halfway through, an artist friend of mine said, look, why don't you just start again and have fun with it? It doesn't look like you're having fun with it. So I was like, well, I mean, I don't think it's going to help, but I suppose I've got nothing to lose. And I did. And, in the space of a couple of hours, this extraordinary sort of slightly cubist sort of thing came out, which was fun to do and was a much, much more interesting thing. And I suddenly thought, well, actually, maybe there's some sort of magic here which I can tap into and have fun with. And it was, at a time in the sort of, so where are we now? In the early 90s.
Yes, which is when we met.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I was, and no one else was doing that sort of thing then. The kind of, all the kind of, part of the reason I didn't go to art school was that the art schools weren't really teaching painting at that time. It was very much about, maybe there's a bit of abstract expressionism and minimalism still going on, but most of it was about, video art, and it was kind of the conceptual art movement was really kind of getting in full swing then. And so, and I enjoyed that sort of those art forms as well. But I knew that I wanted to do painting, and the portraiture was basically initially a way of getting paid to be able to keep doing it and not have to go and get a proper job. I didn't think I'm going to spend my life doing this, but I got just got a handful of commissions, just enough to eke it out. I mean, remember when we first met in the mid-90s? We had no money. I think Sheba, who's now my wife, who was the one who introduced us, and because she was an actress, and I think you've been coaching her, and she would occasionally be earning some money. I very occasionally, but I was getting just enough of these commissions to keep it going. So it got to the point that even a few years later, when things started going well, I was already established as being one of the few people around who was doing portraiture in a sort of vaguely new way.
Yes.
So that's how it kind of happens. It's so slightly accidental.
And so, I'd like to pick up one or two of the points that you've given us, because they're major indicators on the road that you've taken through the chronology of your life and the development of the extraordinary work, as you can see from the portrait here, which is one of your daughters, isn't it?
Yeah.
Your youngest.
Oldest, actually.
Oldest.
It's Tabitha, and she's
Tabitha.
I need to finish it off, but it's difficult doing pictures of people you know very well. I can come on to that later. It's difficult when you don't know people at all, but it's also difficult when you know them really well, especially when they've got young faces. So I always find painting the kids, the most enjoyable thing in some ways, because it's great when you get it right, but it's the hardest because you know every nuance of their expression. And getting back to this thing, I think the reason, going back to Damien's sort of lovely quote there, I think that's a jolt of recognition you get with a portrait if it's right and you know the subject. It feels, that something really connects with us in a way that if it's a bit wrong, then it's, the whole thing, you feel sort of an antipathy towards the work. It's not to say it has to be a photographic likeness. I think that's something that people often get wrong. Sometimes things which are, a very obviously a painted, distorted version of someone, or cartoon-like, or not trying to be realistic, can be much more powerful than ones that are superficially a kind of very highly finished and realistic photographic likeness, because something in it connects with us that communicates the fact that it's that person that we know.
Knowing people in the way that we do when they're intimates is also a vast plethora of information, isn't it, that we receive as stimulant, and that if we're emotionally involved, maybe also that lens that you have, which is highly unique, that you already give us indication of, which arose from, although, as you said, we didn't know it at this time, it arose out of what we now define as ADHD, and that you found a way of stilling yourself so that the chaos of was brought into a very specific focus.
Yeah.
And what happened for you is that you saw faces. And I remember one of the experiences that we had when we first met is that you were seeing a lot of colour as a result of the chemo that you were processing, in not in an out-of-body state, but in a meditative state. You're
Maybe detox.
doing detox,
Part of the process of like detoxing, or because all kinds of funny things happen when you're doing that.
Yeah. And we were interpreting the colour and how through the shards of light that you were seeing, as it were, within your consciousness, faces were appearing, and that you started painting those faces, and then those faces actually became not just imaginary faces, but the faces of human beings that you knew or that you were encountering. So there's evidently something within the way that the whole of your biochemistry functions, that extraordinary combination or marriage between thought and feeling, where your senses, because we know that our senses are at the edge of our consciousness, they give us a sense of, these are my parameters, this is what I am, this is who I am. But your visual is so specific, which it indeed it is for me, which is why I'm able, and have been for years, since childhood, I'm known as synesthetic, which means that I see sound, and I see the spiritual world. So I see the angels, I see dead people, I see elemental forces. So the way that you have this ability to see into someone whom you just meet on, as it were, instantaneously for the first consultation, for the first session. What do you call them? Sessions or consultations?
Yeah, sittings.
Sittings. As opposed to somebody like this beautiful Tabitha, who floods you with the love of her, her entire apparatus, being your babe. That it would stand to reason that it would be simpler and easier to be more specific. When you're painting, is it easier when you're painting somebody not such as Tabitha, but when you're painting somebody who has come to you to commission a portrait, is it easier to know more about them or less about them?
That's a very good question. I think it's good to know a bit about them, but it's also often good not to know too much. Not that that's it's not, it doesn't make the whole thing impossible. It just means it can sometimes take you a bit longer to sort of unlearn what you've you kind of you can, especially with well-known people, you can somehow you can get the sort of stereotypical public image of them, and it's instilled in your head, and it can sometimes take a couple of sessions to sort of actually realize you're dealing with something different, even though you're should be used to it by now. And actually, I mean, in general, I mean, it's kind of one of the sort of, an advantage you have as a portrait painter, because people expect it to take sort of multiple sittings, rather than, I think, if you're a photographer where you have to get it in one go, is that both for you and the sitter, you have to kind of relax into it and allow things to happen, and you never get the best, or hardly ever get the best material on the first day. Sometimes, but somewhere, usually sort of 2 or 3 sittings in, usually people start to relax. There's a point where they sort of feel it's a safe space, it's an unusual space. I think that helps, and you kind of, and often it then starts to turn into a bit of therapy, and they kind of will tell you all about their lives, often unburden themselves of things they don't usually talk about. and I think that helps them, kind of feel more, connected, but also I think it helps, it informs the way you view them, and sometimes the way you shape and construct the picture and what sort of narrative you're telling, however sort of overt or subtle.
And so in a way, through the idea of them unmasking themselves, I mean, that's my phrase, you were talking about sort of, it becomes slightly therapeutic. They literally sit deeper and deeper within their beings, within their souls, within the essence of their force, so that they're able to reveal to you more of who they really are, rather than what they have become.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think, I mean, a lot of things you learn, you kind of figure out sort of retrospectively when you've been doing this a long time. And so, I mean, I do spend probably half my time doing portraits, and a lot of the time experimenting with other things, and everything from vaguely, just obviously portrait-related side projects with people having plastic surgery, or the kind of 3D scanned heads, to really out there things. And then of the ones I do, the portraits, sometimes it's doing family and friends and people I sort of like asked to sit for me, and maybe about a quarter of my time might be spent doing commissions, which I quite enjoy doing when I don't do them all the time. And also they give you a chance to be in a room with some, as we've seen recently, some pretty extraordinary people you wouldn't otherwise get a chance to spend time with. And I think but depending on what the sort of genesis of the process is, if I've been having to arm twist someone to come in to sit for me, or someone's been persuaded by someone they know or an organization to come and sit, and they're doing it slightly because they think they have to do it, that's one, there's a one mindset, and that can sometimes that tends to have one little sort of journey, and can take a little while to get them to sort of relax and drop the mask, as you say. Whereas if people have kind of thought of it for themselves and come and volunteered to do it and commission it, especially, it's almost, but I think you feel they're looking to you to show them who they are, which is kind of obvious, really, because obviously superficially you're literally showing them who they are. But I sense they are. It so often happens that you later on, you tend to keep in touch with people you paint, because you get to know them so well. It's one of the nice little sort of byproducts of it. But and so often, if years later, they'll say, that was such an extraordinary turning point in my life, or a point where I was like changing direction, but didn't know what I wanted. I was about to get divorced, or about to change jobs, or whatever. It's so often a point, like some point in their life, whether it's early, late, or very often in the middle, where then it's an introspective time, and I don't think they're even conscious of it at the time. But this, I think, it is part of their way of trying to ask the outside world who they are and what they should be doing in the world.
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary time of reflection, isn't it? I mean, this is the sense that I'm gaining, so it's only my perception, so forgive me if I'm being presumptuous, but it's a time for them to reflect, to become very introspective, because after all, you are being gently unmasked, so that this great icon of you becomes a testament of what your life is all about. And as you were speaking, I wondered if there were particular professions that actually loan themselves to a really open, transparent appearance that is easy for you to see way, shape and form as you begin to paint.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, beyond the sort of, I think it's more to do with the personality types than professions per se. But then, obviously, certain professions attract certain personality types. So maybe, yes, you could say slightly more the kind of, people who have got very structured sort of business-like sort of day jobs. Maybe sort of, not instinctively as open to this sort of thing, but often the very successful ones, are very out there thinkers, and so and the creative ones tend to more often be immediately open to it because they're looking for that in everything. Having said that, we've talked about it before, but there's certain kind of complications there, because if you're painting someone creative who's a performer, a musician, an actor, obviously, even some politicians I'd class as actors. The performers can take a while to get through to, because they're so good at appearing a certain way and convincing you they're something that's not necessarily who they are. And so, and some of the hardest ones I've ever done were actors who just never dropped the sort of very slick performance.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they kind of, once they realise that this is something different, that they open up. But there's a funny sort of like subgroup there where it can be complicated.
Yeah. So do you have, when you speak of personalities, do you actually have bands of different characteristics? Or rather, a better way of putting it is sort of bands of certain personalities over the years that you've observed this and you've gone, oh, well, he fits in that band or that particular host of characteristics. So he's therefore in the way that we, for example, say, well, actually, he's extrovert. No, she's an introvert. That's very crude. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't consciously kind of attribute sort of people to certain kind of types of characteristics. You certainly start to notice patterns in behaviour, patterns and things that come out. Basically, I'd love to say that it's all very conscious. That thing that on a good day when you absolutely nail a portrait and you somehow get all the different expressions and sides to a personality, or at least a lot of them in one image. I love to say that's because I've worked everything out. People are always asking, well, how do you technically do it? I don't really know.
Yes.
And I think it just seems to happen. And actually, if I overthink it, it doesn't happen.
Yes, because what we're seeing as you speak is that the process is such a one of self-discovery. I mean, it's a true creative, evolutionary process. For you, it's about who it is, not what they are, but indeed, as you were saying about, it's actually more to do with personality types rather than associating them with particular social features or particular professions, etc., etc. That you respond absolutely to the instinct of the moment with the individual, and you feel them. And that moves through you. For example, some great actors, you say, how did you do that? Because they're revered as being genie on stages, like Olivier. And he said, I don't know how I do it, I just do it. In other words, something extraordinary happens within the moment. And that's always the mark of the true genius, isn't it, And one of the things that I do, for example, when I have the great ones who come in, my A-list actors, and there is a mask which is egoic, I try and find a way of seducing them into, can we leave the ego outside, please? Can we just have a professional conversation between two people? Because you'll see that if you can trust me, you're going to actually open up a magician process here that will allow you to benefit in the way that you want to, which is why you've come in the first place. And they suddenly begin to, after a little bit of self-consciousness, they open, because of course great actors, British actors tend to be very reserved about their, shall we say, their professional personality, whereas American actors tend to form a professional personality that is very extrovert. So it's almost as though you walk on a set, you can walk into an interview and just be, as it were, the same individual. British actors tend to be unformed within that. I often see, British actors that I admire and revere hugely being interviewed by Stephen Colbert or somebody in the United States, and they always look slightly gauche. It's almost as though they haven't formulated what they wish to be in those moments and stick to that. The main thing is to keep the main thing, and it becomes a reality. But back to what you were saying. So there's a level of stillness. It feels almost meditative about the way that you train the whole of your consciousness into this extraordinary alchemy that takes place for you when you're painting somebody. Where do you start with
There's stillness, but there's also, I think, to be honest, I think there's also a nervousness that, because you are, especially the kind of the more high pressured ones, portraits where you only got a little bit of time with someone who's kind of very interesting, very, very busy. Like with the King recently, where I had 4 sittings, but each was like an hour, and I was allowed to draw him a bit in other meetings, but you knew you had to get you couldn't just freestyle it and just hope that something happens. There's a bit of pressure that you need to get something in that time. But as you say, unless you calm down and don't worry about it, it's not going to be. You might miss the sort of the more important thing that's going on. But it does. You do need to somehow give yourself that sort of space. And it's a bit easier these days because than it was when I was starting off, and I don't think I even had a camera when I was starting off. You had to get it from the drawings and the sort of what you've got in the sittings. Whereas now you can bring a digital camera in and take
Yeah.
100 photographs. And
Yeah.
then stick
Is that
those
something
around.
you did with King Charles?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and it's also and that is a way of reminding you, a bit of all sorts of different expressions and
Yeah.
movements, and you kind of it's not
Yeah.
quite as good as being there with them, but it definitely is massively better than just relying on your memory of them. But what you need in order to make use of those, you need to kind of figure out who they are and what and sometimes that happens naturally, as we were saying. On the second or third time they sit, they start to sort of relax and drop the pretense, which we all do in some ways a little bit.
Well, nervousness brings
Yeah.
that forth, doesn't it?
Especially
we're
on
always
first
anxious
meeting.
about, am I good enough? Even
Yeah.
with, as you were saying, the wonder of King Charles
Yeah.
III, who's a very extraordinary man, as we know.
Yeah, and in particular if they come to the studio and all the lights are here and I'm staring at them and it's, they're very conscious, that this is also whatever I produce is going to stick around for quite a few years
Yeah.
and so they, our natural instinct is to try to influence it, trying to look good for the camera, and actually that's the sort of, so we're trying to get past that.
So we call that self-consciousness.
Yeah.
What's the alternative?
Well, I think it's something which a bit like just as what I find. I mean, when I'm doing a painting, if I'm too conscious of what the purpose of the painting is, it's like I'm up against a deadline for an exhibition, or I promised to finish that for that unveiling or that opening, or whatever it is. Or just like, is this going to be good enough? I can put it in the show and sell it or whatever, if I can forget about all that and just do something which interests me, there's always the best works.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of try and lie to yourself because, or kind of like, stop that part of your brain going at least when you're doing any painting at some point.
Yeah.
To tap into it. I think we all have this sort of thing of like our kind of conscious mind getting in the way of life.
Yeah. So there's, in the way that I define it for actors, that we move from self-consciousness, which is just being aware of self, into self-awareness, where we become conscious of self in relation to other. And for you, it could be the individual, it could be the canvas, or it could be your paints, or it could be the particular musculature that you're using at that time, meaning how you're mixing colours or, using oils or gouache or whatever you're using. So that you, again, what we're seeing as you describe it is this extraordinary lens that you have, where you, over the years, quite naturalistically, so to speak, going back to what we were saying earlier about, I didn't go to art school. Thank God. Because the wonder of you, the genius of you, would have been straitjacketed into particular forms. Now, if we go along that line, of course, it can teach us something very extraordinary, where we develop versatility of being able to cope with the system and still allow our own personalities to be. But bearing in mind the sensitivity of where you were at that time, if you'd gone, it would have been completely inappropriate for you. And what's actually happened is organically, you've been able to muster all of the innate skills, all of the inherent properties that is the wonder of Jonathan as you bring forth, particularly your social skills, the way that you draw somebody in, and you're such a darling. You make everybody feel so easy, and everybody is everybody. There's no social preference, and it's rather. I'm reminded of my work with Diana, the Diana, Princess of Wales, of how she could talk to everybody as though she were talking to anybody. It wasn't that suddenly social prerogative took over. You go right to the very heart of the soul. And I just wanted to share a quote with you that might also trigger other realities of your experience. Not that this is taking it away from you by mentioning the name of another famous painter, but I just thought this was really interesting. This is Bacon, this is Francis Bacon, when he said the job of the artist is to deepen the mystery. And I feel that that's what you're talking about, because you know that when you meet somebody, they are, they are an enigma. And then you have your own unique ways, being the being that you are, this wonderful being that you are, to be able to seduce them very gently into being utterly who they are on an essential level. And by so doing, you open up this vista of mystery, which is the enigma of what the individual is all about, all the subtle nuances that you seem to be able to find in the way that you form not just the face or the body, but the entire landscape of your canvases. And then your colour seems to point out more specific nuance and subtlety of what the mystery is all about. So that the overall, when we see the portrait, the overall statement is, oh my God, there's the personality. And when I say personality, I don't mean as a mask, a social mask. I mean in the way that I use it, which is the original form of persona, going, persona meaning through sound. You go to the very core of the essence of the individual. And of course, the word persona goes all the way back into the origins of Western civilization, where it was used to rationalize the gravitas, the veritas and the integritas of the individual, their veracity, their truth, their essence, their integrity, as we would say. You go there, whereas many of your colleagues don't, and I feel that that's why you will be, your work is going down in the annals of history, why I fondly say you're a contemporary Van Dyck. Because we know that with Van Dyck, his use of form, his use of colour, his use of shape and texture and density and tonality takes us into the nuancial, which is the very mystery of what life is all about. But that isn't necessarily your quest. Your quest is to do what? When somebody comes.
I don't know. It's interesting. I think the thing about not going to art school, I mean, I think to this day, I wonder whether it was a positive or negative. I think it was a bit of both. And certainly, you're obviously right. I don't think I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I had been to art school, because I'd have been given a toolkit for doing things in the proper way. And a lot of what I do is, I think, I love that you compare me with Van Dyck. I think he was so skilled at most things that I'm insecure about. I wouldn't, I worry about tackling sort of clothes and all kinds of things that he, an artist then would had to do, and I find ways of avoiding it, or and occasionally I'll do it and nail it by accident. But actually, I think that's where your sort of style, a bit like sort of Bacon, who I think evolved the style around what he was afraid of not being able to do. I think probably the one bit where I think I sort of feel like I'm sort of doing a similar thing to Van Dyck is in the way that I think he was very good at making the faces feel alive. If you go into a room of portraits, and his ones tend to stand out from the others, because it's like there's another human being in the room with me, and that's what you're after. Even if the face is like sort of bigger than life or kind of distorted, or the colours are ridiculous, if you can still create that sense that it's not a real person, but it feels like there's something there. That's the where the magic is for me, really.
Yeah. And from a technical point of view, from a craft principle point of view, meaning the expertise that experientially you've created, how is that achieved? Are there a combination of things, or one particular thing? For example, colour and density to create light, so the face lights up.
Yeah. I don't really know. I mean, I did this big BBC Maestro how to do it thing last year, and it was such an interesting experience, because there's like lots of questions like this about how you achieve certain things, which I'd never really ever tried to articulate or been told about. And it's I think you do. I mean, one of the things I've always enjoyed doing. I mean, I hate starting with a blank canvas. And you've seen, everything I start with sort of backgrounds and make them interesting, and then try and pull the faces and pull the composition out of it. And
why is that?
I think, why it started was when I first met you. I couldn't really afford to waste canvases, so if painting wasn't working, I'd paint over it, and literally, for the first half of you doing it, you'd see traces of the picture before, and actually that would help me by bringing in abstract and unexpected elements. And I think also I like the fact that it would kind of influence the colour schemes to be abnormal. I like we were saying, I think there's something really interesting about, if you do everything that's completely naturalistic. I mean, Freud was a brilliant exponent of someone who just saw colour exactly as it was. Drawing could be all over the place, but the colour was so real, it made it feel real. And I think there's something interesting, though, to me, about distorting it a bit, but having the relative skin tones and everything, true to the sort of context of that picture. So something like this, I mean, you can see them all in different ways, and it doesn't. I don't always get it right, but I think when you do get it right, and so if you just masked off the face, it would look very distorted. But within that picture, it's like you're buying into this fact. You're leaving the normal world and going into the world of this picture,
which is the mystery.
Yeah,
that's what's so fascinating. And I feel that we're getting a sense as you speak from this, this wonderful torrent of consciousness that's pouring out of you, that there's an experience where you're able to deal with many references of stimuli, and you still it all so that you can actually see a way of being able to craft whatever is before you. But it's not that actually it's stilled in time. The time aspect keeps moving because we're still at the moment time beings. But you have a way of being able to photograph the different stimuli that serve you, whereas many people would not be able to see them.
Yeah.
Which is the gift of the ADHD, the gift of that autistic part of oneself, which you found a way of grounding within your being, as I found a way of grounding in the early part of my life, because I was all over the shop, what my mother called haywire from an emotional point of view, because of the mood shifts, because I would see force around somebody, and it seemed that I would always evoke a lot of displeasure in people, because I couldn't read and I couldn't process mathematics. And that was because I was dyslexic and synesthetic, which we didn't know about then. And the way that I learned, and I feel that you do this in the focusing of your skill. The word focus means hearth or fire, and that we all know that when we're looking at flames, the whole of our concentration is in the flames. There's something intangibly mysterious and wonderful about watching the flames in all of their permutations, this vital force of energy in front of us. Focus also means that, so how we actually really focus into the objective, and of course this is one of the great skills that actors learn. And I found a way of focusing myself so I wasn't bombarded by all of this in the way that you have done with great portraiture, through getting absolutely still, and therefore got grounded.
I think certainly you realise you have moments of that, and then you try and kind of harness what you're aware of in those moments. I think it's a funny thing to unpick how the sort of the work has evolved in the way that it has. But I think one of the things that happened by accident, but which was really helpful, was when I started to be able to afford up a camera and then digital cameras, and you take pictures of the work as you were going along with it. I very often, because I'd start on these complicated backgrounds or painting over other paintings, but I'd expect to cover it all with a sort of a completely different picture, and I'd start to notice that I sometimes liked the picture when it was half done, the snap I'd taken, more than the finished one, and I couldn't work out why that was. And I think it was this thing of the Bacon's mystery. There was something about it which wasn't unfinished or abstract. It was actually connected more with how I remember images, and remember the experience of being with someone, than a photograph or a photographic painting. And we've all seen the sort of beautifully executed photorealistic sort of portraits, paintings generally, where you're really impressed with the technical skill, but you have no emotional involvement with it, because everything is completely explicit. There's no mystery in it. It's been done from a photograph. All the kind of everything about it. And somehow the paintings which are but also to me paintings that are completely abstract, I sometimes struggle to connect with. They can look very beautiful, but it's the ones where you have the mixture of sort of realism and abstraction. So either the kind of painter style you can understand, even if it's quite distorted, like a Frank Auerbach or someone like that. To the ones, to artists who do what I do, which is a bit more of a sort of collage of the sort of real and the abstract and the stylized. And somehow those, certainly for me, resonate so much more. And maybe to feel, give me a jolt of that's the sort of way I remember, that thing that happened 2 weeks ago, or when I was with that person. I don't remember every detail of the room they were in, in democratic sort of, perfect, everything represented. I remember certain elements. I remember what their eyes were doing. I remember their body language, sort of. I remember the sense of how they were sitting. And then later on, I discovered that some of these things are actually, scientifically how we process, the order we process things we see. If we walk into a room and there's people there, immediately we have to. The people are more important than what's on the wallpaper. If they're looking at you, you have to engage those ones first because they're aware of you, so they might be a threat, or they might know you. The body language will tell you about if they're whether they're a physical threat to you or a potential sexual partner, or what sort of mood they're in. And so all these things actually also there's a bit of science to it as well, that we process what we see by order of priorities. And so, but yeah, I wasn't conscious of all that, but by accident I seem to evolve a style which actually has, is a sort of a bit of a visual representation of that.
And because we can hear that it's so wonderfully complex, I mean, you have an ease using the linguistic that describes it, but actually it's taken your 50 years and more to not, meaning that I'm adding years on, but I mean in the sense of the fact that you didn't start painting until your early 20s, late teens, early 20s. That's what I mean by that chronology, right? That you've been able to observe the process in moments because of the acuteness of your mental body. And obviously the visual cortex is immensely open for you, whereas many other people are very sentient, they feel things. We can deduce this through the language that people use, because when I say we, because I'm visually oriented as well, that I use a lot of visual words, as you do, like perspective, and I need to see what it looks like, And well, when I look at their faces, rather than, well, when I feel, somebody who's auditory will say, well, actually, she's a bit of a blabbermouth, isn't she? God, that's as clear as a bell. All of these phrases or words that we use unconsciously to give information about who we are. One of the questions that I wanted to ask, as I see the light flood through your consciousness, is, are there particular colours that awaken you?
I mean, yes, I guess in different ways. It's funny, obviously, kind of recently, people have been asking me a lot about colours, and
I wonder why. Because I wanted to mention that as well, because we know that that's been a point of huge controversy. Whereas, we're celebrating it. For many people, they've been rather shocked by it. And it surely must be to do with the vibration of red and what it's excited in people's bodies and psyche.
Yeah, it's funny, because as you can see, I think this painting is even redder than the one of the king, actually, in reality. But at this scale, no one's ever really kind of particularly sort of reacted to the red paintings I've done, on and off over the years more than any of the others. The king had actually, I'd done a previous commission for him of someone else in similar colours, which he really liked. So I didn't think he'd be worried about it. This canvas here was actually I had two canvases made when I was starting that project, because it was an unusual, very large size. I thought, I always have a spare in case it's going badly, which it sometimes does.
And the size, just so that we have that our wonderful viewers can have a perspective of it.
Yeah.
It's how big?
So this is the portrait of the king, which I did, commissioned by the Drapers Society, livery company. And it is
in other words, to hang in their halls.
In their hall, which is a kind of like this grand hall with dozens of portraits of previous monarchs, all on more or less the same scale, fit the sort of wood panel room, and they're all 7.5 or about 8.5 feet with the frames tall, so big, and they're mostly these sort of like life-size figures surrounded by the finery of whatever the setting was. And I was I didn't want to do something that was kind of like looking like a traditional painting, plot something else. I don't really do that, but also I felt that it was a bit of a cliche. There's so many rather stiff and dull portraits I feel of royal family, particularly in recent decades, where there's almost some sort of unspoken rule that you had to do it in a sort of retro style, which didn't seem very interesting. There are a few artists who've done interesting things with it, memorably Freud, but a few others stand out. They don't always work, but they, at least you think, well, surely there's something interesting to be done there. And I think also our, new king is more interested in art and painting himself than any of his the recent predecessors. So I think I didn't feel worried about it, but I did prepare two canvases. I was expecting to do it more on slightly more traditional, probably a sort of green or the muted background. So I prepared one like that. And I had a spare one, so I did it in these sort of colours, which I thought would be fun. And I just thought, well, it's unlike, you never know. And also, sometimes you paint on red background or bright background, like I did with the Tony Blair project, actually. and end up covering it all, in his case, except for the poppy, which I sort of left as the red. And it can be actually a nice, it's an old painter's trick for making the sort of like colours subtly vibrant, because a bit of the red comes through, but you're not superficially aware of it. And so I did this fun one as a sort of as a backup, but I thought that's probably a bit too strong. It might drown the picture out. But as soon as I'd done it, I loved it. I thought, well, whatever I do on here is going to be a good painting. And then the kind of and this was about the time that I moved into this new studio, and a lot of things were sort of changing, and he'd just become king as well. We'd started this project when he was still Prince of Wales, and I got to know him a bit, and I'd got to know him a bit over the years anyway. But I had a nice little opportunity to get to know him, and then suddenly he's in this very public role, and also suddenly the kind of the painting became a bigger deal, and so I just started in this thing. But I was like, I came in and looked at them side by side. I wasn't feeling any interest at all in the sort of muted colours, and I loved these really strong. I thought, well, I will have a go on this one. I'll just do this one first, and it's taking me so long to organise the sittings with him. I've probably got many months in which, if it goes badly, if it's too mad, I can go back to, do another version. And just immediately putting brush to canvas, it just felt like an exciting picture. And it's one of those ones where, I don't even remember painting the face. Usually that's the hardest bit, but I had a very strong sense of who he was. And I really, I'm not a royalist. I hadn't really, obviously we were aware of who they all are, and I didn't have a strong view. But I really liked him, and I painted his wife a few years before, who's fabulous, and
meaning the present queen,
current,
Camilla, yes.
our current queen, who's a lovely, down to earth, funny, brilliant person, and I got to know him, met him at that time, and he just found this very very sympathetic, very kind person, very sort of deeply sort of thoughtful, curious about everything, interested in people, but also a very sensitive soul. With a fan, but also could be very funny. His dad was funny and in a slightly more aggressive way.
Whom you also painted.
I also painted, yeah. So those are the three I painted.
A different sitter.
Yeah, exactly. Very competitive person.
Yeah. So the red really did enable the amplification of clarity within your knowing of Charles to come about.
Yeah, so I should back it up a bit. So I wouldn't have even considered the red, except that they wanted him painted, the drapers wanted him painted in his red Welsh Guards uniform. And they said, look, if you really hate that, you can do something else. And I did hate it at first thought, because I thought, well, that's going to just suck all the attention out of the rest of the painting, which it always does every time he's photographed or painted in that. But they weren't in it. But I thought, well, I haven't seen any good paintings of him in that uniform at all. I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to do something that's actually figuring out a way of tackling this sort of the kind of problem of the colour. And it's red because it's a military thing, and it was I don't know, it was scare people in battle or not show if you're wounded, whatever the reason was. I'm sure someone can tell me. But that's how it started. So I thought, well, actually, I'll do it like this, and I can either mute the colours later, or I can paint over the background. And there's a sort of version where I think it's one of these here where I tried it out, and I was doing lots of studies and sketches and trying things out. And I didn't like any of them as much as the actual painting, and so and then in a few days out of nowhere, I was like I'd seen him, and then I had all these photos everywhere, and I was just like sort of channeling his face. That seemed so quickly to work, and I didn't want to touch it, and so the rest of it was then just a sort of process of working out how much, a bit like we were talking about earlier, how much to feel like it's a real image, or it's like you're sort of a sort of slightly otherworldly feeling representation. And I think that there's also this funny thing, this thing that kind of occurred to me when I was doing it, which is that he's wearing this military uniform, which is a strange anachronistic thing in a way, but then it's a signifier. We recognise what the sort of role is and the sort of tradition of it. And so how do you sort of tell that story that had a purpose 300 years ago, 500 years ago, that leaders had to look powerful, or they might be deposed. They might literally be under threat. Whereas now it seems ridiculous, and what they represent now is this slight sort of fairy tale that we buy into, this sort of mysticism that they're different from us, and we know they're not. We read in the newspapers all the sort of like their human failings. But at the same time, we want to buy into it. The reason why everyone kind of like is interested in them.
Well, they're representative on an archetypal level, aren't they? So they are actually keys into our consciousness. But at the same time, they're real human beings.
Yeah, and so we know both those things.
Yeah.
And yet we still and there's a complete contradiction in a way. And I thought maybe a nice way of showing that is that this, to have this sort of like completely otherworldly color going on. So it's like by putting that pinky red everywhere. It's sort of suddenly I was thinking you're more in sort of Barbie land, you're in Disneyland, but sort of like slightly psychedelic version of it, and yet but you've got this like sort of figure in this kind of almost sort of quasi religious sort of pose front on, which most of the world portraits aren't actually, and the stability. You've got the sword in his hand, firmly planted. All this thing.
This is the first time you painted a significant individual like the king in a uniform.
Yeah.
So again, we have that subtle masking because we know that the uniform is a representation of a certain social status, and as you already indicated for you is anachronistic. And yet, what you were doing is respecting the desire of the Draper's company, the Westwood company, and bringing it into this wonderful. I mean, dare I use the word iconoclastic? Because you've taken us into a very new vista of the way that portraiture for the king of the country or any other noble mean can be painted. And the portrait became extremely controversial as a result of the redness.
Yeah.
Can you take us just through a brief description of how that felt to you as the artist?
Well, it's a funny thing. I mean, because of course I've learnt over the years that people do interpret things sometimes in the way you intend, but very often not. And so, you can either make it very, very obvious what you're trying to do, and in some ways,
you made it obvious.
I thought I was in a way with the butterfly and that kind of thing.
When he unveiled the portrait, there was a huge wave that passed all around the planet. And how did that feel? Because most of it was controversial, most of it was negative.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think what I didn't. Wasn't it? I mean, so once I'd done the picture, and I was still, the stage of not really, was prepared to sort of like tone it down or change it if it felt wrong. But you then sort of scan all the ways different people could be reading things into it, messages about Diana or Prince Harry or whatever. And yes, it occurred to me, red is a emotive color. It looks a bit more pinky red in reality than it does in the reproduction.
Yes, because as you mentioned to me earlier, that in the reproductions in newspapers or magazines or indeed online, that the redness was much pinkier in your conception than actually what was presented, which suddenly became red upon red upon red.
Yes.
And of course we know red is one of the greatest exciters.
Yeah.
Red rag to a bull, the Scarlet Woman, it's associated with extraordinary, fiery creativity,
but also love and passion.
Absolutely.
Red hearts. It's like it's all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so yes, I was expecting people to sort of like read it in different ways. I wasn't, for people to sort of pick up on it being about the military past or blood or that thing. I wasn't expecting it to like go very hard than that. But obviously, it was related to the military. I was trying to diffuse the military sort of symbolism rather than exaggerate it, but maybe
well, we're living in a time of war. We're living in a time of bloodshed.
Yeah.
We're living in a time of horror where everybody's lives are on edge, not feeling safe, not feeling secure. And if we did, we'd be sociopaths.
Yeah.
So what the point that I'm really moving to is that you have a skill of being able, in your wonderful quizzical way, of being able to create an iconic representation of somebody's soul. And what this does, particularly with icons like King Charles, is that it activates people. And you bring about healing as a result, because the more activated we are, the more conscious we become aware of our reactionary process, which is really what all of our conflicts about.
Yeah.
They're about reacting, and therefore people becoming defensive and wanting revenge. And as we see in the polarization of that conflict in the Middle East, in Gaza, that it's not working, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You're actually exciting all of that out of people, do you see? So there's a very profound healing taking place. But I remember we spoke at the time that the portrait had been unveiled, and you were extraordinary. You were beautifully detached, but also in great mirth about the fact that it had become the controversy that it had become.
Well, I think.
How do you feel about it now?
It's funny. Well, there was a funny thing actually, because in the immediate run up to it, because of course I finished the painting. So the last sitting was in November last year, when and it was about 80% done, and I was also showing it to him for the first time. I thought, well, I better, it's an unusual painting. I better check he's okay with it, and he saw it, and he kind of was surprised, but I think pleased with it, and he was particularly interested in how I'd done his face and the butterfly and everything. I don't remember him commenting particularly on the colour, but he sort of remarked on something, it's kind of an unusual picture, but but I could tell he couldn't take his eyes off it and was sort of smiling, so I thought it was a good thing. I remember, but then then I had to finish off the medals, which was difficult, and he had new medals to becoming king. And while that was happening, before it was unveiled, we found out that he had cancer. And I don't know if even he knew, and we did the last sitting. I'd been ill last year as well, and that I hadn't really talked about that. And I was my worry in the run up to it was suddenly I was like thinking, oh, maybe that was the first time I was really thinking, well, because obviously blood is one of many sort of things you can associate with red, and I thought, oh, that would be annoying if everyone starts to sort of see it as a big commentary on his illness. And that was genuinely my main worry in the run up to the unveiling. And so that when the kind of reaction all happened, and it was everything, you saw it all. I mean, it's kind of everything from, it's about anger, it's about war, it's about, the sort of colonial past, it's emerging out of, kind of soup or whatever, or it's, the oil protesters have attacked it. Some of it was very funny. And then there was it was like, well, that's ridiculous. Hang on, okay, but this will go away in a day or two. And
oh, this was your reaction?
It was my reaction, yeah.
Well, this is just absurd,
Yeah.
Because it was a contortion of different impressions.
So I was kind of like, it was like, on the one hand, slightly annoyed that everyone was like, coming up with some ridiculous things, but at the same time, slightly relieved it wasn't the sort of thing that I was fearing. And then, but instead of dying down after a day or two, it just kind of kept on evolving. And it's like my daughters who are on TikTok started sending me all these incredible conspiracy theories. And about how there was symbolism and satanic symbols and devil worshipping and all this wonderful crazy stuff, where everyone's you realize it's and that's one thing, and then on another level it's like it's on Saturday Night Live. It's being sort of lampooned or kind of referenced in all the sort of mainstream shows, Joe Rogan and Daily Show and I Got News for You and all these things, and you realize it's become sort of part of the culture. And some places, they're discussing it seriously, and what the symbolism about, and that sort of thing, and the butterfly, and lots of things, which where there is a lot to talk about. And you realise it's sort of something; it's become public property. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what you do or say. You're not going to change.
And how did it feel?
It was kind of sort of terrifying and exhilarating initially, but you feel out of control of something. When you feel out of control of something, and some aspects of it are great, and some are kind of not. And everyone's
but that awareness. Sorry to interrupt you, but that awareness is actually the appreciation of the fact that this was a huge force.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you were feeling the force, which is atavistic. It's primal. It's actually. I mean, this is slightly different, but there's a parallel in the experience. The force that was released when Diana died, and I mention it simply because the anniversary of her 27th anniversary was just a week ago, 2 weeks ago. There's an archetypal force of Shakti that was released as a healing energy.
Yeah.
So our hearts were awoken in that situation where we were taken back to the love of our own mothers, or the fact that we had not forgiven, or whatever, the arousal of the divine feminine, of finding ways of developing greater compassion, greater love, greater unconditionality, greater equality, and greater empathy.
Yeah.
So you were also exciting a force.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we'd had a conversation about redness, I would have said, Johnny, are you sure? Because after all, you're hitting not this area, but you're hitting this area. And this is one of the most disturbed areas of our beings where we have unresolved crises. And so by exciting with an iconic figure like King Charles, who of course is very much in our mind because A, he's just become king through the awful lamentation of his dear mother passing, and then suddenly he has cancer.
Yes.
I wonder if you'll be asked to paint the Princess of Wales. That would be interesting.
She'd be really interesting, I think. She'd be. I think she's the other one who I think would be really interesting to paint. I think, and especially after what she's been through now.
Yeah, because I'm also thinking of the individual as they review the portrait of themselves, of how revelatory it is for them.
Yeah.
Does it remind them of particular aspects of their being? Yeah. Does it awaken within them, oh my gosh, there's a lot of work that I need to do on my being. I don't just mean on the physical carapace, you know, but actually because you paint inwardly, not outwardly, although we have an outward impression through the canvas. It's actually all about the inner presence of the individual.
It's interesting. I think the thing with the reaction is that, you know, ultimately, initially you're thinking, why aren't people seeing the painting the way I see it? And obviously my main aim with it was obviously to hint at other stories, but above all show who I think he is. And I felt some of that was getting lost, but then when you start to sort of read the messages you're getting and vast numbers of kind of communications. A lot of people are. I think they kind of they say, well, at first I was shocked, but then I realised, what this is saying about him. And like you were saying, the exaggerated version you saw on some news programmes was kind of quite a different, I think, way of seeing it than in the flesh. It's got a weird calmness to it, and I think that's partly his expression in the pose, and also the sheer size of it. Forces you to kind of like sort of people will go into the gallery where it was on show afterwards and stand in sort of awed silence looking at it.
Responding to its majesty.
Yeah, there's something that it just has some paintings have a presence, and that one has a particular tone, and it's amplified by the size. And the chaos of the brushstrokes in the background, are a nice juxtaposition to the calm expression, I think. But it doesn't feel like an angry painting. But no one that says that when they see it. And in fact, it's now in Buckingham Palace and there for their summer opening, and in the ballroom on its own stage. And I went to see it for the first time last week, and it was very spectacular. But it was also interesting talking to the guards, the staff there who sort of stand by it. That they say a lot of people come in and are shocked to see it, and they're thinking it's because they've got a view about it, and then they spend a bit of time there and they go away with it, saying it was different from what I expected. I like this.
This is what I was meaning earlier on, because you paint people's souls. And so putting the soul of King Charles into that context with all the other forms, and we're largely talking about the red that surrounds him and the vastness, this very august frame, that it excites different things, but actually it brings people to a different reckoning about themselves. That's what's exciting about it. We could say that the same thing was happening 300 years ago with Van Dyck, but he was painting specific people, in the same context as this, but iconic representations of nobility. And he was actually able to mean something. It became a cipher by which something else could be read. I see your work as a lodestone within the annals of history, do you see? Because you're painting, as we see the ages shift. And obviously what's happening at the moment is that we're seeing the Western world that we once knew, that we were born into, is something which is vitally different from that impulse. And you're providing us with a definition. As you look into the journey, as you reflect over the last 30 years, two questions. Firstly, in just 3 or 4 words, how does it feel?
The journey. It's amazing. It feels. It's sort of
just 3 or 4 words.
It makes sense in retrospect.
Amazing, exciting, it makes sense in retrospect. Wow. So you're seeing the whole shape of your destiny. And each turn has been where the wheel of fortune... What?
Well, not all of it, but but enough that you can see that there was sense to things that seemed senseless at the time. You know,
but you've made sense of them.
Yeah, and they kind of, the other things wouldn't have happened if it weren't for that. And it's like, I mean, not everything. And, there are lots of things that I wished hadn't happened. But at the same time, you start to trust that actually, maybe things will work out all right.
Yeah, exactly. And so you see the largesse of your chronology and all the twists and turns. And we haven't talked about lean years, which was one of the points that I wanted to go into, because I know that through our very honest conversations, more in the past than the recent period of time, that there were lean years. And for those people who are great artists, great creators, but perhaps are experiencing a paucity, those awful sort of doldrums, the lean years, is there a particular piece of succor or advice that you could provide, just in a swift sentence?
I think that I feel that it's a bit. I mean, maybe it's a bit of a cliche, but I think that those are often times where you end up also sort of thinking you need to do something that other people want, and that actually makes things worse. And at some point, either it gets so bad, or you have some sort of moment of clarity, or something bounces you into a different direction, and you start doing what you want again, and then usually things start to go better.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't always work as cleanly as that.
So it's a time of redefining self.
Yeah, and so I think make sure you're doing it on your own terms rather than other people's. It's not always possible, but I think it's not to say stop doing the thing that's going to kind of help you immediately at the time. But I think certainly that's always the danger. You get sort of like feel like you're being told to do something differently, and you get the wrong message from it, which is like you should be doing something like other people are doing, or that you think other people want.
And a lot of people offer advice because they, out of whatever consideration, particularly if one's suffering, which a lot of artists do when they're not creating, they're in the doldrums. And also there's the fixation that we have of doing, particularly today because, we're so hyper-stimulated, we're pixelated in our consciousness by social media meta. So that's beautiful. It's a time of self-reflection and that all conditions are temporary. So... And I know that that's something that you steered your way through, that you navigated through those choppy waters or very still waters.
I think all artists have to. I mean, it was just a handful of very successful from early on and always successful. But almost all the artists I know have had periods, if not currently, but certainly along the way, where things have been tight. And you never feel like, secure because, you don't have a salary and a pension, all that sort of thing that, most people have. And so you have this sort of thing, well, even if it's going well now, I'm not sure how it's going to be in sort of 2 or 3 years' time. Yeah. And so you don't take things for granted. At the same time, if you're lucky enough to be doing something you enjoy, at least enjoy most of the time, then actually that is the sort of such a compensation. That if you can, as long as you're not literally starving. I think we're all kind of conscious that we could be doing things if we were kind of more comfortable, and but at the same time, it's much better to be enjoying what we do.
Hallelujah, hallelujah. That's the point. What do you feel successful?
Partially, I think. Yeah.
Partially.
I think.
Which part of you is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, certainly one of the things that you want to achieve in an artist is people to be discussing your work, which has clearly happened recently.
Which is clearly happening, yes. So you're talking about a longevity of the experience that people have of your art. So therefore, this is success.
Yeah. I mean,
if you were to, so float up, as you would when you're approaching somebody's sitting and you're just about to start, and there you are in your sort of eagle's eyrie looking detached and observing. What is success? Yeah,
I mean, I guess doing portraits was one part of what I wanted to do, but it wasn't. But I feel like there's a lot of other things that either I've made a start to, but get other people to understand, or I haven't even made a start to. And I was a kid, I wanted to make films. I still, I studied a bit of that and loved doing that. I doubt that'll ever happen because that's just the sheer amount of time you'd have to invest in it. But so at the one hand, I've learned that sort of actually anything's possible. Things might come in unexpected ways, but the most unlikely things are possible in life, and so nothing's impossible. But I feel that there's lots that I would like to do which I probably won't have time to do, and that's frustrating.
Unless you make time, which is evidently what's going to happen over the next 20, 25, 30 years. And I hope much more, but I've reached a certain point where I'm looking at the next 30 years and thinking, okay, so what have I achieved and what do I want to achieve? And I feel as though I've just arrived and I'm just starting. So surely success is sustainable joy. Because you're giving us a sense of, well, there is this I want to do and this I want to do. Well, of course, because you're polyglot, you have this fascinating creative intelligence, which is always going to be reaching in this direction, this direction, this direction. And sometimes you do it, it doesn't really work, so you leave it, and sometimes you go back, and so forth and so forth. But through doing all of this, you reach points of priority. And there's suddenly a detonation, an activation, and there's a win. And I guess that helps us really define what the core elements of our artistry is all about. Because also you're dependent to a degree on the response-worthiness of your work. Because, obviously, as the artist that you are, you're an expresser, and so an expressor. You're looking for, not approval, but you're looking for a response, and you hope it's going to be a favourable response. But as we've seen with the portrait of King Charles, that actually it hasn't always been a favourable response, but it's been response-worthy. That must be an immense exhilaration.
Yeah. And also, I've been doing it long enough to know that if everyone feels the same way about a work, then even if they say it's great, no one then talks about it afterwards. You need to get people arguing and disagreeing and seeing it in different ways. I mean, ideally, the majority will like it, and 80% will like it, and 20% won't. But it's certainly without that 20%, it gets forgotten. And you don't know which work's going to do it. I mean, obviously, when he became king, it suddenly became more likely that this work would get seriously discussed, but it's never a certainty. I've done other works in the past which I assume, because there's a brilliantly clever story to it, and it was so obvious to me, and the kind of, and people pay no attention at all. And so you just, I don't trust myself to kind of completely predict those things right. Obviously, in the run up to it, and it's only the point a month or so before when, we found that he was going to unveil it and it was going to be at the palace, and then it became more likely that it would be a big deal. But certainly, through most of the process, I had no sense that it would be anything like the reaction it got.
And it seems that, within the whole process of the way that how you've responded to the reaction, that you've been immensely stoical. Because, initially a lot of people would have been upset. Well, you're not perceiving this accurately. This is not what I'm all about. This is, what the portrait is this. But actually you stepped back and you detached and you observed the whole thing with glee. Not out of anarchic ridiculousness, but actually you just appreciated the whole wave of what was happening because you were getting a reaction.
But something I remember talking about with Damien years ago is that, I think artists like us often forget that we're in the entertainment business. Actually, yes, see some kind of been making vast quantities of expensive things, and I think too many artists feel they need to be philosophers or kind of intellectual giants and all these other things, and actually forget that at the end of the day, this is not life or death for most people. It's something to be interested, something to do at a weekend, something to go and discuss, something to talk about at school or in their art class or whatever. And so, if people find a way of making it fun, then that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. You're stimulating huge possibilities in people. You're stimulating the infinite potential of people because it gets them thinking and feeling. So we're recording this in September 2024, and you've been so generous with your time. We need to reach a point of completion. And I wonder if you could give us an inkling of how you feel the possibility of the next project developing for you. Any ideas?
I don't know. I kind of deliberately waited to see how the various things this year would play out. And so I haven't committed to exhibitions and all the things I would normally do and have a sort of like a roadmap of stuff. There's some interesting things that were already floating around, which are like a big public sculpture project, sort of like DVD documentary, some other and some of the kind of experiments we were doing with new technologies. We have students and others coming in and working here, experimenting on sort of often face-related technologies. And so I think seeing how those things, kind of resolve might be really exciting. But there's, but then part of it, like I think you said it earlier, the part of the fun of the job, and particularly the portraits, is you don't know who's going to, who'll be on the end of the phone when it rings tomorrow. Yeah. And sometimes that can, change the direction of things, in an instant.
So, if I were a magician, or if I were a genie in a bottle, because there is a genie aspect about you, and I was reminded earlier when you were talking about the extraordinary experiential nature of the way that your life, your work, your artistry has developed, that it reminded me very much of the classical definitions that we hear arising out of the Italian Renaissance with great artists like Michelangelo and Giotto, where they believed firmly that they actually had another presence in the form of a genie, which was their guardian angel, that they know actually brought divine inspiration. So all they did was to prepare their craft skills, and then they would wait for the inspiration to flow through them. In many ways, you do the same thing. So if I were your genie, and I could give you anything you wanted in terms of the next project, what would it be?
Well, I think it would either be, sort of like someone who was up for doing a kind of really unusual sort of film project or sort of immersive project, which enabled me to bring some of the ideas from the paintings into it, and satisfy that side of me. But I think that's a bit less likely. I think the more interesting thing.
I can give you anything.
Okay, anything. I think that
What's your heart's desire?
Well, the other thing I love. One of the nice things about the Portrait of the King was not just the fact that I was able to tell the story with it in a way because of the scale of it, partly because of what we know about him, but partly because of the what I had to do with it and the sort of like traditional role it was kind of supposed to fulfill, and therefore we could deviate from in terms of the look of it, the sort of the format, what you were playing with, and also the fact that the way everyone you have expectations about that sort of royal portraiture, which you can play against. And I think to have having started that again, and obviously something I've done in different ways of painting in the past, but now I think having got people's sort of focus on it, I hope I get a few other really interesting
I can give you anything you want. Just tell me. Ask and it is given.
If I knew it,
so another really interesting project, because actually I felt so fulfilled by this particular project that it is a pinnacle of my career thus far. And so what I would like is something else like this, but to take me on another trajectory so that I can feel the richness of what I'm all about.
Well, exactly.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Well, if I was being greedy, I'd say I'd like to do another sort of half a dozen things like that. So a pope, one of whoever's whoever the most interesting creative people in the world who are changing our world.
Mention names. Pope?
I don't know. I mean, I think, and then on the sort of like leadership level, then I guess it's people like Greta Thunberg and Zelensky, and I don't know if I'm a bit kind of too timid to go and paint Putin, but I think people who are influential and are going to
maybe Miss Harris.
Maybe exactly. Okay. Kamala Harris would be a very good one.
Okay, this is what I was searching.
Exactly.
Okay, this is wonderful. You see, because I will give you all of these. I'm your genie. I will give you all of these things. From your mouth to God's ears, Jonathan Yeo, this has been a remarkable conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been absolutely extraordinary. I hope you've enjoyed this.
It's a great pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see you, Stuart. I wish we should see each other more often.
We will do this.